Our Wednesday regulars on Breaking Politics are the Labor MP for the Melbourne electorate of La Trobe, Laura Smythe, and Joshua Frydenberg, the Liberal MP in the Melbourne electorate of Kooyong. They join us both via a Google Hangout this morning. Good morning to you both. Joshua Frydenberg, first to you. The Libs in the last few days have had the joys of seeing some good opinion poll numbers, but also the cringe moments of hearing Tony Abbott unleashed on a few of his comments. Tell us, how did you feel when you heard him and his sex appeal comment about candidate Fiona Scott?
Oh, look, that was a light-hearted comment, and Fiona Scott said she was completely untroubled by it, and the caravan's moved on, Tim. So, you know, I think, again, if the Labor Party wants to play that up, that's politics of distraction as opposed to talking about the big issues, namely the collapse in government revenue under the pre-election fiscal outlook that was released yesterday, the continuous arrivals of unauthorised boats, and they're the big issues, not these little distractions that happen to both sides on the campaign trail.
Laura Smythe, who joins us, I'm not quite sure, Laura, which highway you're on, but you might give us a quick location check there in Melbourne to start. Welcome on. Is Josh Frydenberg right when he says this is just a minor distraction, forget it, or does it tell us something about Tony Abbott?
Ferntree Gully and a train line, Tim, this morning, happily parked near one. Look, I think that Mr. Abbott's comments over the last few days have been a bit cringeworthy. But I think ultimately, it's for Australians to decide, what kind of leader they want to see and how they want to see that person articulate for a modern, sophisticated Australian society. It's up to the judgment of each individual elector to have a look at Mr. Abbott's comments as the leader of his party and potentially the leader of the nation walking the global stage. So, I don't think I'm going to dwell on it too much. I think there are a range of other issues that are out there that are pretty pressing, namely that we simply haven't seen what the opposition's costings on virtually anything are. And so I'm very happy to turn my attention to those things today.
Okay,
Can I just say there?
Of course.
I mean, if Laura wants to talk about, the reputation on the global stage, well, just walked into a knuckle sandwich there, because Kevin Rudd goes and leaks conversations that he has with President Bush, which is a great embarrassment to Australia. He then allegedly says at a meeting to journalists at Copenhagen that the Chinese are rat effings because they haven't come along on the climate change issue. I mean, you could go on with Kevin Rudd's mistakes on the world stage. I mean, a lot of them have been deep embarrassments, not just for the Labor Party, but for our country.
Laura, are you at all embarrassed by Kevin Rudd's performance on the world stage at various times in the past?
I think the Prime Minister's been an extraordinarily strong performer on the world stage. I think, most people around the country would appreciate that. He's got very strong relationships with certainly many of our regional neighbours and more broadly, around the globe. I think that really what the issue is more about is who is standing, who is vying for the Prime Ministership of this country. And in Tony Abbott, we see someone who is still not prepared to front up with his own costings so that the Australian people can understand what his policy agenda might look like and how it might impact on the budget bottom line. I'm pretty keen to hear about that. I'm pretty keen to hear from the alternative leader of our nation about what he sees for Australia's future in terms of austerity.
Well, let's talk about costings in a second, but just before we leave the issue of that sex appeal comment, it sounds at least like you're saying it does tell us a little bit about who Tony Abbott is.
Look, I think it's ultimately for every person who's watching, every person who has a vote in this election, to have a look at each of the leaders, and certainly to have a look at if you like, the unscripted comments of Tony Abbott. And he's certainly, he has had an opportunity to put his case as an alternative Prime Minister. I'd like to see him focused on some fairly significant issues relating to his own costings at the moment. I think it's regrettable that over the last few days he's had a few things to say that are a bit cringeworthy, and I think that every Australian gets a chance to make up their mind about whether he's a good leader or not.
Joshua Frydenberg, on the question of costings, how late could the coalition leave the release of its full list of costings and bottom line, and you would still be comfortable? When would you think it would be fair enough for the coalition to leave its costings, complete costings, until in this campaign?
Well, Tim, Labor has a very short memory here because, as you probably remember, in the 2007 election, Labor didn't release its costings until the Friday before the election. So that's one day before the election. We've said we'll do a lot better than that, and we'll release our costings in good time. I can't give you a date because we've got to work through yesterday's announcement together with a whole series of other issues. We've put more than 200 of our policies to the Parliamentary Budget Office, but we are absolutely committed to releasing those costings. We know that our policies, unlike the Labor Party's, are fully funded, and we also know that when we promise that we'll deliver a surplus, we will, because in the 12 budgets that we unveiled when we were in government, 10 of those were budget surpluses, whereas the last 10 Labor budgets have all been deficits, and then they've promised the next two budgets to come to also be in deficit. And what was revealed by yesterday's pre-election fiscal outlook was that the economy continues to deteriorate. A collapse of more than $30 billion in the revenue forecasts, a budget deficit more than $30 billion, and unemployment growing to more than 6.25% by 2014. There's got to be some level of accountability here, Tim. I mean, Labor's been in government for nearly 6 years. So when are they going to actually take responsibility? Stop blaming it on the GFC, which is now long gone, and start taking responsibility for their graphic economic failures. We'll release our costings, we'll be funded, and we will get the budget back into balance as quickly as possible.
Laura Smythe, has Josh got a point in suggesting that Labor needs to actually say, well, at least some of the bad news in PFO and the earlier economic statement actually rests with the government and not the cooling of the China resources boom?
I think the first point for me to make is to pick up on a little bit of Josh's take on the history of the Howard government. I mean, in terms of delivering surpluses at that time, we looked at a government that was higher taxing than us as a proportion of GDP, that spent almost nothing really meaningfully on infrastructure, and which had a fairly significant privatisation agenda. So, that was a relatively interesting formula for achieving surpluses. I think that it would be worth looking at that, and it would be worth acknowledging that the GFC, Josh, was more than a blip on the radar of the global economy. I think we need to actually have the opposition, concede that it was a fairly significant impact, and that if it had been on their watch that the GFC occurred, we would have seen hundreds of thousands fewer jobs in Australia. But I think, the point remains. It is the case that about 2 weeks ago now we had the economic statement released. PFO is consistent with that economic statement. The opposition has had long enough an opposition that has been calling for an election for 3 years. From the day and hour that we were elected, has been calling for an election. One would have thought that they would have been in a position to articulate their policies and cost them by now.
And Joshua Frydenberg, it's not just a question of the costings and when, is it? It's now whether the promises will be delivered, given that West Australian Liberal MP Don Randall has conceded that in government, an Abbott government might actually have to reverse some of its election promises, depending on the state of the books as it finds them when it gets into government. Now, that was a striking but perhaps pleasing burst of honesty, wasn't it?
Well, that comment's just wrong. We will absolutely deliver on all our promises in government, as we have done previously. And let me just point out to Laura two things. One is that actually the government's revenue tax take is now more than $75 billion a year than in the last year of the Howard government. So when she talks about revenue, it's actually up more than $75 billion. And when you talk about the China boom, the terms of trade, in fact, the price of exports to imports, is now at least 15% higher than at any time during the Howard government. So that's the opportunity that you have to actually balance the books. We'll deliver on our promises as we've done in the past, and we'll do again.
Okay, and to close, green preferences. Josh Frydenberg, what does it say that you now preference the Greens lower than you preference your old traditional enemy? Doesn't it say that you've recognised the Greens are now a significant force in Australian politics and you actually have to deal with them more than you do your traditional enemy Labor?
No, Tim, the message is very clear, and we've said this all along. Australians deserve better than they've had for the last 3 years. They do not deserve another minority government, another hung parliament. And that's what our preference deal, or our preferences are all about. We do not want to see another minority government. Australians deserve stability, security, and the understanding that a government can actually govern. And that's not what we've seen in the last few years. It's about jobs. It's about getting some stability in the economy, not the chaos and the dysfunction and the disunity that we've had the last few years.
Laura Smythe and Josh Frydenberg, very grateful for you coming on Breaking Politics this morning. We'll look forward to talking to you again next Wednesday.
Thanks
Tim.
very much.
Thanks, Laura.